So my name is Shamila Chaudhary. I have lived in DC now for over 2 decades, and I've always been creative and an artist since I was a child. Of course, it's not something that I was encouraged to do for a living, and so I sort of put my artistic pursuits in the background and began a career in foreign policy. So I moved to DC in '99 for graduate school. I went to American University, studied international affairs, and right at the end of my master's degree, 9/11 happened. And so all of the opportunities available to a lot of us that were studying international affairs at the time were rooted very much in what the government was calling the war on terror at the time. And in hindsight, it makes a lot of sense, right? If you work in foreign policy, you work on whatever the issues are of the time. Hi. I'm just quickly introducing myself. But at the time, I didn't realize. I thought it was just kind of a stroke of luck. I was studying South Asia. I was interested in Afghanistan and Pakistan and the Middle East. And this huge event had happened. A very terrible event had happened, and the US was involved. And so I got pulled into that. And so I spent my whole career working on counterterrorism, looking at issues in South Asia. So when I say South Asia, I mean Pakistan, Afghanistan, and then Al-Qaeda, the Taliban. Like, these were all topics that I became exposed to through the US government. My family is originally from Pakistan. We came to the States in 1980. I was only 2 when we came, so I actually don't have much memory of that time period, but obviously my family stayed in touch, and there was a closeness just through our family connections. But I actually didn't go back to Pakistan until I was 16. So, and I make a point of saying that because my exposure to the country was largely intellectual. It's based on curiosity, right? It wasn't because I was going every summer and visiting relatives. It was really, when you're 16, your brain is being imprinted quite heavily, right? And so it made a big impression on me. And I think it eventually, when 9/11 happened, I was studying South Asia, and it got me really interested in this. So fast forward, I'm working in government for almost 2 decades, and I decide that it's time to leave. And I leave this was not linked, but I did leave right when the US government captured and killed Osama bin Laden. So I was working at the White House at the time, and it just so happened that I had worked for a long time, and I thought, okay, it's time to leave. And the reason I decided to leave was that at some point I started thinking about, well, what are my ideas and my own thoughts? When you're in government, you talk about we, right? You often will hear, and some of you might be in government yourself, it's like the royal we, right? And I was really good at that, right? And I spent my whole career doing that, as many of my colleagues still do. But I had this nagging feeling in the back of my head of, what do I think, right? I don't actually know, because I haven't exercised that part of my brain. And we all know that the brain works as a muscle, right? So I pushed myself to leave, and when I left, I also, I was married, and I had 2 children being out of government. And when I was on maternity leave for the first time, so my daughter is now 11, my son is 8. So when I was on maternity leave for the 11-year-old, I started this work, okay? So in the first year of her life, I'm sitting at home on maternity leave, literally bored out of my mind, because you can't read a history book when you're on maternity leave, right? It's hard. If you can, I admire you. I couldn't, and so I needed to do something that made me feel productive. And I joke that, because producing a human being and raising it was not productive enough for me. I needed to do something else. And so I started to just doodle and sketch and in little notebooks. And I brought some of those sketches to show you. In those early years, in those doodles and sketches, I actually wasn't thinking about the shapes or the lines. I was sort of there's a blank piece of paper in front of me, and I've got some color and some pencils, and I just sort of let whatever came out, right? And it's interesting because it was almost like I was just, it was something that had to come through me. And it's hard for me to explain it that way because I come from a discipline that's very verbal and that is steeped in a written tradition as well, and in documents, right, and talking points. And so I struggled with that, but I was like, you know what, it's actually healthy for me to kind of push myself out of my comfort zone. And again, it was happening in parallel to me pushing myself out of my comfort zone as a person, right? Being a new parent, being a mother, being a woman who has a small child with her is kind of, I felt a little bit embarrassed sometimes because I was like lugging this huge stroller around and the baby was crying and I felt like it was disruptive when I was in public. And so I felt like, why not like make myself fully uncomfortable because I'm going through all kinds of different discomforts, right? And so it was part of that, in hindsight, again, I'm thinking through it today and I was like, oh, I was really encouraging myself, like subconsciously, to try things that I was not comfortable with. One thing I was not comfortable with was making art that was not perfect, that was not evenly shaped and had a beginning, middle, and an end that I knew what it would look like, right? And so none of this art is actually planned, what you see. None of this was something that I sketched out mathematically and that I knew that all these pieces are gonna be here. None of this is like that. And what happened, and it was funny because I took a friend to see the exhibit the other day and he asked me like, well, where do you start the pieces? And almost all of them start from the lower left-hand corner. Why is that? I'm left-handed, right? So it was the easiest thing to do. And I don't have an easel. I just sit on the floor and I will do the work, right? So I also don't have a studio. It's just my house. And as much as I've tried, every room that was a studio turned into a toy room. So, so just to go back to the point of nothing is planned here. And so what it is essentially, you know, this was one of the first pieces I did. I have a blank canvas and I create a backdrop, right? And the backdrop is very simple. I use brushes, I use acrylic, watercolor, gouache paints, and I just color it. And it's kind of patchwork, right? So there's lots of different colors in the background. You can get a flavor of this when you see you know, behind the detail, there's a layer of abstraction and color. That's the base, what I call the base layer. In this case of this piece in particular, I started off just painting it and there was a base layer here. And then I just put it away for about 6-7 months, maybe more, right? And I didn't know what I was gonna do with it. So I just ignored it. Then I started this piece, right? Because I was at the art store and I found this, this gesso board and I thought it was really cool and geometric. I just liked the actual medium, right? The background. And so I got this and I started working on that a little bit. So these ones that you see that have the really crisp detail, those are actually, I do use pencil as a kind of base layer and then I paint over it. But what I draw with the pencil is still not planned out. It starts kind of on the bottom left. I draw something and then I see kind of what goes with it. And I just let my imagination kind of take me where it does. And what I thought was interesting about these pieces, and you'll see it throughout, is that there was a consistency in the colors that I was using, the motifs, the patterns, lines, dots, and then some of the iconography that is there. It's consistent throughout, and it wasn't deliberate at first, but then at some point it became deliberate because I realized that I was telling a story about characters. There's characters here in this set of paintings. And even in this centerpiece here, it's connected to the paintings, right? And sometimes we don't realize that we're telling a story until we're out of, there's a story until we're out of it. And that was very much kind of, I think, my experience and my colleagues' experience of working on conflict and the war, right? And not realizing fully what was going on until it was all over. And that brings me to the title of the exhibit, which is, I chose to call it Attention Surplus Disorder. There could have been a lot of different names for it, to be honest, and I can get into that. But I realized that in looking through all the pieces and looking through my intention of doing the work and how it came out, I was overwhelmed with a lot of the kind of the ideas and the feelings and assumptions in my head about like what should art be, or what, you know, what's going to make it look good, what's a perfect piece of art that people will like. And that made me realize that there's some parallels there with our experience of the war too, right? We didn't actually know what was happening, right? But we thought we could curate it. We thought that we could make it so 1 + 2 + 3 = whatever number, right? Didn't end up that way, right? It ended up looking something very different, very unplanned. The other thing that made me title this attention surplus disorder was that when I first started having people view the work, which was very late in the process, a lot of my viewers were like, I don't know where to look. There's no focal point. I'm feeling kind of confused, and there's a lot of color, which makes me keep wanting to look at it. And then I was like, oh God, this is the point, right? Like, this is what was happening in my head when I'm trying to sort through these issues of the conflict and the war that you know, and I'm talking in particular about Afghanistan, but this could be Iraq, this could be Vietnam, this could be really any kind of conflict that you know, that our society is experiencing. You could even apply it to issues such as the climate emergency, right? Not realizing something is happening and then realizing it and being shocked by it, right? Not being able to see it because you're too close. So there's like a surplus of attention devoted to some things and not enough on others. And so our surplus of attention when 9/11 happened was fear, naturally, right? So this is a story about fear and reconciling that with what was happening in the world, but it's also, for me, a story about how that fear forced me to rethink our own history and how we learn our history. And I think a lot of you will relate to this, that it doesn't have to do just with 9/11 or the war in Afghanistan, which made me realize a lot of things about our history in the Muslim world. But you know, things like when we talk about topics of slavery, or when we take down Confederate statues, and not really knowing when Confederate statues went up and why, and or understanding that they're meaningful to some people and they equally good and bad, right? And so I think America, in our political consciousness and social consciousness, has had to kind of reconcile a lot of these competing narratives in our minds about what we feel connected to and then what we are shocked by, right? And so I see that also as part of the story of this exhibit. And there are nods to some of the domestic issues that we've been going through in the past 10 years that I'll point out to you. How much time do I have, by the way? An hour? Yeah. Okay, all right, I'm not gonna talk very long. I'm gonna, because I promised there would be something interactive. Okay, so let's do this. Let's do the interactive part now, okay? So I'm gonna give each of you, all right, let's take one and pass it around. There should be plenty. Mm-hmm. That's fun. Mm-hmm. Okay, so when I started to show my friends the work, and they were like, I don't know what to focus on, but then if you keep looking at stuff, you'll find things, right? And I've actually hidden things in the work. Now, I haven't hidden them for you necessarily. So one other theme or approach that I want to share with you is that a lot of these pieces, both I'm going to just call this the blurry one, or the pixelated one that's more impressionistic, and the more crisp ones, they have in their base layers things that I've drawn in there, but then I drew over. And sometimes I drew over them because I just thought they were ugly and they didn't look good. But other times I drew over them because I wanted it to be hidden, because we hide things, right? In kind of our journey of self-discovery as a country, or as people, or as individuals, right? So there are things hidden in here. There are also things that are not hidden, but they're a little obscured, or they're non-figurative, so you won't exactly know what you see. But so under the scavenger hunt, the bullets, so there's the letters USA are in one of these paintings somewhere. There's a drone in one of them. Look for the Twin Towers, a plane, a heart, a serpent or snake's head, and a baby, okay? Now you might find them in more than one, or you might see it in more than one. Maybe I didn't put more than one in, but you might see it. So that's what I want you to look around for. Take a few minutes to look at each of the pieces, okay? I'm gonna give you some time because you have to kind of stare at it, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right, did anyone find the letters USA? No. Okay, so Chris, I'm gonna call on you, I'm gonna direct you to turn around.
Okay.
Now look at the lower left-hand quadrant of that. Can you find USA there? USA, yeah. It's hard to see though, right?
This one has the most stuff. It has a lot.
So this one is called Consciousness and Collapse, and again, it was one of the earlier pieces that I did, and this one I would say has the most combination of domestic and foreign kind of policy issues that I was processing in my head when I was working on it. So I didn't intend for all of it to go down into the piece of art, but I was thinking about these things. And so when I was done with it, I looked at it and I thought, oh wow, this is like literally everything that's in my head right now. And I think a lot of you can relate just when you're reading the news every day. And if you use social media to read your news, a lot of the subjects are kind of jumbled into one. So you'll see one tweet about a foreign event. You'll see another one about like entertainment. You'll see another one about something totally random, right? And I think that's sort of the effect. This is a visual representation of the effect of that kind of news and the format and the modality. And so that's sort of how I saw this. This is just kind of what I vomited out because there's a lot going on. But so let me talk about the USA really quick and then I can get into some of the others. But so these are a few characters. The U is on one character, and they're all kind of warped representations of people. You know, they don't look exactly like people. They're weird creatures, and there's a lot of dysmorphia there with the bodies. But USA, and these are what I like to call like the three, they're like the three ugly Americans, and it's like represents kind of the worst of the narratives that we're encountering in our politics, right? Now that might mean something different for you depending on what your views are, right? But that's just, again, it's not a specific judgment, but it's a judgment there, right? Because the ugly American, there's definitely judgment in that. These same figures also show up in that first painting. In the upper left corner, you see there's another ugly American holding a flag, right? But this is the ugly American ascendant, right? It has kind of like a barbarian's, what do you call it? A ball with spikes on it, right? And is strong and big and outsized and is proudly holding the flag, right? That's in juxtaposition to what I like to call the bureaucrat in the bottom right corner of just kind of, she's like wearing her suit and she's like, just seems dismayed and defeated and beleaguered, right? And the flag is kind of upside down and facing downwards. So these are related. Those two paintings, even though this one's quite crisp and this is overwhelming in a different way than that one is, they share characters, okay? And that was definitely deliberate. These folks, I'm thinking they might show up. They show up in that piece behind you as well. There's more ugly Americans here, and they're even more obscured, but here's one, right? Here's another. There they are again, these guys. So there's the three, right? I'm not sure why I did three. There's always three. But so that's a theme that I was thinking through in my head of like, well, art, what does it mean? What am I thinking, ugly American? What does that mean? Are these people that I just disagree with and I can't connect to? Or is there something deeper, darker, that we all have there's a collective responsibility there of like, there's part of our histories that we haven't really fully reconciled or talked about. In this case, I'm thinking more about like race politics and, the civil rights movement and this idea that America is this great shining city on a hill when it's, every country has a myth. We kind of build our political strength on these myths and our sense of citizenship, but they're not true. Myths are not true. They're meant for certain purposes. So for me, it's like all of those issues kind of wrapped up in one, and this is how I was thinking of it visually. The rest of this work, I would say, is more autobiographical in that I was putting aspects of my own nostalgia in here visually, right? And I think a lot of people can relate to that. It's like, you know, when you were a kid, you have swing sets and those awful like metal things at the playground in the 80s that we used to ride, and, you know, houses and homes and scooters and that sort of thing, right? I grew up in the Midwest, as I said, so there's a lot of Midwest imagery of the landscape that I incorporate here. I also grew up in a very interfaith kind of environment, meaning there's a lot of diversity in Northwest Ohio. There's a huge Jewish community that came after World War II, and a lot of immigrants from Eastern Europe who are not Jewish, and then South Asian immigrants, Middle Eastern. And so I've incorporated a lot of religious symbols from those, you know, just from my upbringing. That's just not my own personal upbringing, but the environment that I grew up in. So this is really a testament to some of that too. There's a few other things in here that were on the list. Did anyone else find anything in here? Okay, you want to point it out for me? Yeah, so there's the head, right? And then, so this one, more than all of the others, has the serpent very prominent. So it's, you know, basically everywhere you see, there's a serpent kind of weaving its way through things. You'll see it more once you realize all the way over here. And again, that speaks to the, you know, the thing that you don't know is there, but it's like kind of slithering around and lingering, and it could be any of the things that we've been grappling with as a society, right? I mean, there's, like I said, there's climate emergencies that we think about. There's social injustices, racial injustices, et cetera, you know. And to me, the serpent was also interesting because it evokes kind of religious connotations as well. And there's a lot, I borrow a lot from that throughout, this sense of that there's this kind of evil lingering around us. And sometimes it's quite mundane, it's hidden. You don't know that it's there. The serpent for me also, just in the Abrahamic tradition, it kind of represents the idea of choice, you know, in stories at least. So I think that's probably where I was coming from a little bit as well. Okay, so the serpent is in here. Anything else people found in this one? Targets, yep.
Pigs.
Pigs.
Got a barn and sun.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Are those UFOs up in the
They are, yes.
Thanks.
So this scene is a difficult one, and it's, I mean, this is very, in some ways, it's very visceral, right, and graphic, but it's cartoony too because of the way I drew it and the colors, right, and so it's causes some confusion, I think, or I mean, I would hope that it does. Like, what am I supposed to feel that? There's like women wearing bikinis and a guy kind of straddling the head there. And when I painted this, I was working through some ideas in my head about how the conflict between the, you know, Western societies or the global North comes up against, or how the global North and Western societies kind of perceive the East, right, in very stereotypical ways. Like, you know, women, I mean, these are women with their head covered and their faces are covered actually, right? Then they have, then I've painted targets over them, right? But kind of the insults of like making fun of Muslims, or like, you know, by making jokes about pork, for example, because Muslims don't eat pork, or, you know, or just kind of the clash between Eastern and Western cultures, right? Like that tension there. Not all of which I felt personally, but I observed as kind of a very weird and ugly part of human dynamics. And some of it did manifest in wartime when people would, you know, go overseas and interact with people in Iraq or Afghanistan for the first time. I mean, we were sending Americans to these countries, Americans who had never left their hometowns, right? And so you can imagine that tension that people felt, rightfully, because of lack of exposure. So here I'm taking it to kind of an absurdist, I'm giving it an absurdist quality on purpose, right? I don't believe that it's at this level of absurdity always. But that's kind of how I wanted to depict it, just to make the point. This scene right here, so you see, there's only it's not a little bit of black, but in terms of the negative space, the less detailed space, it's this black corner, right? And this scene right here is connected to that scene right there. So this painting is a more detailed version of what's going on in this corner, right? So this is my interpretation of something in the Islamic faith, which we call the Day of Judgment. It's the end of the world. I think that all the Abrahamic faiths have some concept of this, but it's, this is the end of the world happening right here. And everyone kind of gets a little post-apocalyptic when bad things happen in politics, right? And so it's like, oh, could this finally be the end of the world? Like, oh no, so-and-so is elected and this happened. And, there was this disaster and natural disaster. And so I, like a lot of people, had these thoughts in my head and again, kind of made it comical almost, right? Or pretty with the bright colors. So let's talk about this really quick, what this is. So Day of Judgment, in kind of my upbringing, learning about it, is, it's the end of the world. It's, the world is going to end one day, right? And so when it does end, we will, the stories that are told that I was told was that the sun will come so close to the earth and that things will start to kind of melt, right? They will become so hot that, and the sun will explode and things start to disintegrate, right? And you won't recognize each other, right? And so here in this piece, which is called Day of Judgment Part 1, everyone is wearing a blindfold, right? Can't see each other. There's one person in there that's not wearing a blindfold, and I'll talk about that. But you don't recognize each other, right? Things are kind of collapsing around you. The way I drew this, it's almost like warped, like the landscape is kind of like warping on top of each other, right? That's all very intentional. I wanted to, again, make this a global kind of focus. So here we have, there's a woman up here mourning someone. It's clearly a US veteran story, right? Because we've got red, white, and blue. We've got the flag here encased. And then at the same time, over here, this landscape is much more Eastern. And there are also people kind of longing or missing others that they've lost, right? So I just wanted to kind of show the parallels there in kind of the East and the West. I use a lot of, I studied Arabic for a long time. I don't have any skills anymore, but I use a lot of the Islamic, I borrow a lot from Islamic architecture, which is largely calligraphy and patterns. It's not in Islamic tradition to paint faces, so I don't really have a lot of faces, which I think I'm subconsciously informed by that as well. But you'll see words and letters that kind of look like Arabic, but I've warped them because just to show like, oh, it's something familiar, but it's also, you don't actually know what it is, right?
Are you saying there's no faces in there?
Well, there are faces here, but what I don't do figurative faces, right? And there are a few eyes that I started injecting, and that was very deliberate. But here, so this is someone who doesn't have a blindfold. Does that remind you of anybody?
Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this,
Orange.
yeah. So it's Donald Trump. Again, it's not a realistic depiction of him, but
Is that Barack Obama on the right of him?
no, this is it's just him, Donald Trump, by himself, and he's instrumental to this painting. Like, he's very central. You see that everything above him is disintegrating, right? So the background is black. So it's like, the black is not meant to be evil though. The black is meant to be like this is empty space. That's how I felt it was, right? But you could interpret it as evil, of course. But here he has like arrows coming into him, right? He's being attacked by all sides. That's part of a narrative that he believes to be true. His body is actually the body of the serpent. It's the same serpent, right? But we don't know if it's his body or is he being consumed by the serpent. That's not clear to me when I made it, right? I realized what I'd done, and I thought, well, it wasn't my intention to make it part of his body, but it kind of looks like it is, right? So this is very interesting. He's the only one that doesn't have his eyes covered. I don't know why I did that.
Are you saying that's not a face right next to him then?
No, this is a face, yeah, but there's a mask here on it. Yeah, these folks have masks on, all of them. That's on purpose. So this is that kind of, this piece is that corner kind of zoomed in. This is something I like to do is, because I'm actually first a photographer, and I kind of see painting as in terms of some photographic concepts. So that was interesting that I was thinking of it that way. But yeah, so these two are connected. Does anyone know what this means? Okay, it could be a keyboard. So it's a government document that's been redacted, right?
Oh.
So parts of it.
Never would have thought of
Yeah, no, it does look like a keyboard now that you all have mentioned it. That's right. Yours is a civilian answer, right? But that's why I asked you, what does it look like to you? Because that means something different if it's a keyboard to you, right? So with this one, I had painted the whole thing. So where it's black, there were actually scenes there. But then as I got more and more into it, I thought, Day of Judgment is when things fall apart. So this actually has to have much more negative space. That's what I'm calling the black negative space. This one was really interesting for me to do and work on because I kept seeing more and more things here. Yeah.
You say you work with other people on that?
Yeah, and this one too. So those are my children and their friends. And so as we all know, in the past 10 years, one big event that happened was COVID. And so we stayed at home a lot. And I was working on my pieces, and the children got involved. And they're all pretty artistic. And so I asked them to do the work with me. And so this one in particular, the top part was largely the base layer. So not what you see, but what's underneath was worked on by my collaborators, Neve and Layla and Zane. So Layla and Zane are my kids. And I needed their help because it's a lot of detail.
Yeah.
And I needed to kind of, at some point it became an energy issue, and also my eyes, after a while, they start to, they get tired, right? And so I would have them do the less detailed work, and sometimes they would just color it all red. Sometimes I would tell them, make 12 white circles, and they would do that for me, and then I fill it all in, right? I put the patterns, I put the detail. So that's what I like to say, that I'm not, I don't feel, people are like, oh, the work is so colorful. That's what you first see. I don't feel like I'm working with color. I feel like I'm working with patterns. Another example of that is that I was telling Tim this, like I do a lot of the work like in my living room, which is not good studio light. And this piece, for example, looks totally different to me hanging up. It's like a new piece. I feel like I'm just meeting this piece because of the studio light and the way that the colors are popping off. So when I was doing the work, I was more interested in creating the patterns, right? So I knew I was working with the black, or I knew I was working with the pink. And what was more important to me was to have this many dots, right? And then pink dots. And then I knew each pink dot was gonna have 6 light pink dots, right? And so because I work in patterns, I'm able to really adjust kind of the location of where I work, right? I don't need the light, for example, so I don't depend on it that much. So this piece in particular, I would say, is the one that's most pattern dependent, and it was challenging because it's so large. And I only really did this because I met a friend who, I became friends with somebody who's an artist, and he worked in really big canvases, and he saw my work and he's like, you know, you should push yourself and work on something big. And I'm like, oh God, I can't do that. It's gonna take me forever, which it did. It took 8 years. But this was a way to push, again, me out of my comfort zone, because there's so much detail in all the rest of the work that even ironically, this is very detailed. It didn't really become anything until I created these big characters to kind of pull the focus, right? So when we think about attention surplus disorder, it's like you're overly focused on one thing and you don't know where to direct yourself. This piece, the process to make this piece exemplifies that, because I just had like, you know, it was just making patterns and like architectural, like arches and minarets and stuff, but what were you looking at, right? And that was when I realized like, oh, I need to work big, right? And so this woman became the centerpiece of the painting for me. And what I put in here in terms of what's happening, you may see something else, but here is a woman who is sitting very comfortably, having a cup of tea, and there's, you know, here's another person serving tea to someone who looks like they're working, right? That is not an iPhone, by the way. That is a BlackBerry. Does anybody know what BlackBerry is? So I'm dating myself here. But this is, again, this is the same bureaucrat. She's active here, though. There she's like kind of downtrodden, right? Here she's active. She's working, you know? But she's being watched. This person is watching all of this, right? So there's this kind of surveillance aspect to things. And then there are some people here. These people are less prominent. And then we got these two figures here on the side. This is a man holding an AK-47.
Oh, serious?
Yeah, and a lot of people thought that was like an umbrella. Like my kids thought that was an umbrella. But this is very much about, it's a comment on like the political elite of countries where the U.S. works, which you know, the U.S. relies on the support of foreign governments to do a lot in other countries, right? And in particular in the war on terror. And the political elite is very much an enabler of all the things that we're able to succeed in, right? And watches kind of as we do these things. And this is, to me, this was kind of an example of that, right? This is where the drone is. I don't think anybody found it because I obscured it on purpose. But here's and then here's the wing of the drone. Now the drones all look different, right? So you wouldn't have found it, but that's part of the point, right? Because drone wars are covert. Also, drones are not bad, they're technology, right? Not all drones are used for war, right? Yeah, so, but this was me kind of thinking through concepts that, you know, I worked on, but if I have a clearance in a lot of these jobs, I'm not supposed to talk about these issues, right? And so I don't, but I can draw them and then I hide them, you know, and that's kind of a commentary on kind of what it means to, you know, you work on classified, as a public servant, you may work on classified issues that you have to compartmentalize in order to do the work, right? And this to me kind of exemplifies that. There's so much hidden here. This is quite busy, right? But back to the kids, it's really important. I'm glad you guys asked about the collaborators. When the kids started working on it with me, it was during COVID, but then you know, they kept working on it with me basically past COVID, and the war in Ukraine happened, right? So Russia invaded Ukraine. And so the kids actually were coming home talking about that war because it was being discussed at school, even at their elementary level. There are a few things that struck me. One was that when I was a kid, the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan and the US was helping you know, the Afghans and with the help of the Pakistanis. And now we were in another situation where the, you know, Russians had invaded another country and my kids are learning about it, right? So as we're working together on these things, my son starts to draw things like these are missiles that he drew. I didn't draw those, you know, but they're learning about these things. And so they start drawing these things into the piece because I tell them this piece is about war, you know, and then questions come up like, why are you talking about this old war? There's a new war that's happening now. We should be talking about the new war, you know? Yeah, and I said, well, if you don't talk about the old wars, you might make the same mistakes, right? So to me, this piece actually for me became a vehicle to talk about really difficult issues with not just the children, but maybe with people who just don't work on them day to day. This row right here? Well, when I had drawn that part of the, so again, this was what I drew first, this left-hand corner here. For me, those were intended to be protesters, but that is not what most people see. Most people will see folks that are hanging from something or holding something up, right? But again, it's part of the obscuring and causing confusion about what the purpose is or who they are is it's part of the kind of intention there. It's part of the mystery, right? And a lot of this is, I use these kind of just architectural design and, the detail of a lot of the, the buildings that you'll see in Eastern cultures. Also just because I think it's beautiful, but it also obscures in a way that's effective. Here, this is the one piece that I think, this one and that one over there, I've used oil pastels as well to give it just a bolder look. This was really hard for me because I'm like, it's not enough dots. It's not detailed enough, but this was part of the, like, make something and then do the opposite of what you feel, sort of. That's why, and this is why I have these 3 lines here. I'm like, you know what? I've organized this too much. I'm gonna mess it up just a little bit, So.
Is that a tomb in the lower right?
Yes, these are tombs. Yeah, this is a graveyard here, which is the obvious. If you have the show is about war, so I think that's the most obvious part of it. But
are the people anyone in particular? Like, is the woman anyone in particular?
No, this is more like a community graveyard. That's how I thought of it. Like right by the houses. It's in the village. So. Did anyone find the baby? Or a baby?
I think we found a pregnant lady.
Mm-hmm. That counts.
Cool.
Okay.
There's a hand holding.
Yeah. Yes, that's a baby.
Oh, great. Good job, Wendy.
So this is let's finish with this piece and this piece. So when we were hanging the show, Tim and Cassie, who works here, were helping me think through the pieces, and I always wanted this piece to be last, meaning the last thing you see. So I wanted you to start here and go all the way around. And can anyone can anyone read my mind why I wanted that to be the last piece? This is the one for me that has the most humanity, right? Because they're people for people's, like it's about the individuals, right? It's about we're looking at their eyes have expression, even though it's still kind of like flat and cartoony, that's the style, but it's, you're supposed to see their eyes, right? They're looking at you, and they're also very much together. As a photographer, I love negative space, and this one, when I started it out, actually, you'll see the background is, what I painted originally was the leaves.
Oh, I love that.
That was the background. And then these people were here, and I thought, no, it's not enough focus on them. And so the black is intended to really kind of refocus the viewer on the humanity of these people. And these could be anybody. It's no one side in a war. These could be the people that went and served in Afghanistan, and they met there, and then they got married and moved back to the States, right? These could be people that live in villages of Iraq that were affected. Could really be anybody, right? But I titled it, they still managed to find each other. So in all this mess of detail, of, stormy topics, your consciousness is collapsing, you can't see clearly, you can still find each other, right? You can still find someone. And I wanted the viewer, the audience, to be left with that. And then even in the shapes of the background, the petals that are falling, there's some movement there, right? And it's pretty, it's not dark, it's not, these aren't like difficult topics, it's just, leaves, So this one was, it was interesting because as I was sketching it out, instead of a baby, like I had originally put like an AK-47 again. My husband was like, I think you've drawn enough AK-47s. So this is how I wanted to leave the viewer. And then this piece is, how is this piece connected to all the work? How do you see it connected? Do you see images or things drawn in? Like, are you finding stuff the same way you found stuff in the canvases? No. That was not my intention. This one here, my husband saw faces. That's not, I didn't mean that. So this, to me, so this work I've been doing the whole time throughout, and I've sold a lot of these and given them away. So I'm constantly making these, but these pieces are another example of kind of the practical aspect of this exhibit, which is, as I was, I said I was on maternity leave 2 times and was trying to, balance my life with being productive and also being a new parent. I was able to do this work anywhere. I could just take it with me. We were on a road trip visiting my parents. I would just put this in the car and I would do it. And it really was mostly just for to relax and to achieve like good mental health practice, right? So this was all done after I developed these patterns and motifs. And the other reason I had the realization I had when I was doing these just for my own health was that, wow, these patterns and motifs look so different to me in the sphere form, right? Even the cubes and the bowls, they don't look the same. The sphere there's something really powerful about the motifs in this sphere form. And it feels very beautiful for me. It's a very beautiful experience. There's a lot of layering that happens. So I wanted to show you kind of some of the works in progress, so you can get a sense of it. So this is the kids' work on these too. So this is my neighbor worked on this side. My son worked on this side. Solid wood, yeah. So they paint and they do whatever they want, and then I take it and I turn it into this, right? So there's lots of layers of paint on this. Here's a small one that you can see. One of the kids did this one, right? But it's also just very satisfying, right? You like hold it. They look different on the North and South poles, and that's why I incorporated the mirrors, because I wanted you to be able to see how different. I wanted you to be able to see like 2 or 3 different forms, right, of the art. So this was what we kind of came up in terms of display. But I like your comment about the celestial, and it kind of nods to some of the architecture, but also the scenes. And I think there's definitely that aspect. You could argue that this is some of the landscape of that work kind of in sphere form, right? Like this could very much be part of the sky there. And then these are unfinished pieces, like very unfinished, but I just wanted to show you, and then I have some sketches if you want to pass them around, kind of show you where the work starts. It looks very different, right? So this is what, this could end up being this basically, right? So I've painted like a base layer several times, and then I'll go over it and paint shapes, and I'll go over it again and do that. Here's another, yeah, almost like a grid, or even like, this one reminds me of stained glass, but this still doesn't have a lot of detail in it, right? It's gonna get much more detailed. And this one is just me kind of playing around with the shapes that we, yeah, so I spent a couple of years doing sketches like this. So you'll see, here, let me pass around just a couple of them. Here's another one. This is a collage that inspired this one, which is a collage. And then you'll see in this one.
Wait, that one is a collage?
This one's a collage, yeah, of my sketches. Some of these sketches I cut up and I put in there. Here's another one that one also has a lot of similarity with this. Yeah, so I mean, I spent like a couple years just doing this,
Yeah.
right? Which is like, what is this? It's just a study, right? Let's see, what do I else got here? Yeah, so I had a lot of fun in practice, like thinking through. And I think some of these might end up being part of other pieces eventually, but it's funny because I show people this because everyone's like, oh, it's done. And I'm like, it's 5% done.
How do you know when you're done?
You just know. It just speaks to you. So that one, I knew I had to finish it for the show. So I really I rallied for that one. But also I had to, it wasn't done until I was comfortable, right? And then at some point my family was teasing me. They're just like, don't need any more dots on that. And I'm like, it's not about the dots, it's about the balance, people. So yeah, so that's it. That's all I have to say for today. Thank you. Thank you for being a great audience and finding so many things in the pieces.